All right, well, here we go. So we're going to finish up power distance. We didn't quite get that done. We're pretty much right on schedule. So just as a quick review, who typically decides how much power distance there will be between the boss and the employee, or the king and the subjects? Yeah.
It's like the subject, right?
Yeah, depending on the culture, but by and large, at least historically, it's what the populace will tolerate. And of course, once a totalitarian government gets big enough, then it doesn't matter what they'll tolerate. You know, but as a general rule, it has really been a matter of what the population will tolerate in terms of leadership. Okay, let's just imagine for a minute that, let's say you're a low power distance leader, okay? But God has led you to a country that is very high power distance, Japan, you know, someplace like that. All right, so you as a low power distance leader are going to experience what potential frustrations or challenges? You're low power distance. Let's say you're ministering. Let's give this a church context. You're part of a church plant. Maybe you're the pastor guys or ladies. You know, you're a leader in the church, a pastor's wife or somebody else like that, church planter's wife. What are some potential challenges you will face ministering to people in a high power distance culture? Emma?
You might want their input on even just understanding the culture and like how to, and they probably will have, like, you make the decision, like this is your whole thing.
Okay.
That might be a question.
Yeah, you made a good point. You might want their input, not just to make decisions regarding, you know, the church and its function, but even about their culture, and they may be hesitant to offer that. Okay, good. What else might you experience? Delaney?
It might be uncomfortable for you. Like, I know, so my dad's a pastor, and we have a family in our church who just moved from Nigeria, and they tend to treat him with, like, so much respect. And he's very much like, as a pastor, he should be the one to go last, he should be the one to, like, take the least. And they're very much like they want to give him the most. And so there's a little tension there.
Okay. And so what can often happen in a situation like that is that no leadership happens because you're low power distance, so you want to include them, so you're hesitating, and they want you to just take the ball and run with it, and so there's almost a stalemate of sorts where neither one is actually exercising leadership. I remember one time when I was in India, I spoke at a conference, and I spoke on a platform that had a little railing going around it. And at the end of the conference, on the last day, they asked me to come over to the edge of the platform. It was probably about 3 feet high off the ground, and to greet people. And here I am standing up on this platform and reaching down and shaking hands. I felt like a politician, shaking hands with people, and people grabbed my hand, and I felt like I was being treated like the Archbishop of Canterbury. You know, and it was awkward. I just didn't want that. There were people that would come down and almost kneel in front of you and say thank you, you know, and they're not trying to worship you as God, but they're just expressing an incredibly high power distance in the way that they treat you. And I had to learn, I had to intentionally discipline myself not to view that as worship or something like that. It was just an expression of respect that I wasn't accustomed to. Didn't make it wrong, just made it different. Now let's flip the coin. Let's say that you are a very high power distance oriented person, okay? And then you come to the Western world, and now you're ministering to very low power distance mentalities here in the West. What challenges might you face as a high power distance leader in that context? Okay, Paul, I'll start with you. You come from a high power distance culture, right?
I grew up in both cultures.
That's true. You really have an advantage having grown up in a dual cultural reality.
I guess for a low part culture, like the only experience I ever experienced would be you have to, what can I say, everybody's welcomed, even if you're not, everybody welcomes you in a respectful way, even if you're in a low class, they still like want you to feel like you belong with them. In Congo, if you're in low class, pretty much you the one have to greet those in high class.
Okay.
Just like you say, kind of bowing down to them, looking up to them, saying, you're this high, I'm this low.
Okay.
There's no respect.
Interesting. So the high class doesn't cater to the low class. It's the low class that caters to the high class. Interesting. Yeah. It's hard for. Yeah. Go ahead, Justin.
Oh yeah. So I was just thinking that the person from high power distance going to a low power distance might interpret the opposite thing you did. They might be thinking they're being disrespected, have to discipline their mind think that way because maybe someone does just want to show friendliness to them, but they're thinking, and they're just all over me. They're coming up to me.
Yeah.
It would be a little different.
Right. Yeah, it would be very easy. Probably one of the biggest temptations for a high power distance leader in a low power distance context is to feel disrespected. They don't appreciate me. They don't honor my position. Right? For example, I've had people here at Faith, students come in as freshmen, they say, hi, Mark, and I'm not offended by that. I know that our protocol here is to address your professors by Mr. or Doctor or whatever. But when a student comes in and says, hi, Mark, I don't just say, where's your respect, I understand that normally that happens because that student comes from an environment where perhaps even his pastor said, hey, don't call me Pastor so-and-so, call me Richard or whatever, But there's, when he first says, hello, Mark, there's that initial, just a little bit of a reaction inside. And then I have to take a deep breath and say, wait a minute. See, and we're in a low power distance culture, okay? So I think it's important, whichever side of the equation you're on, that you understand the ease with which you can misinterpret one another, okay, on both sides. And if both sides are aware of that, and really who has the greater responsibility to be aware of that? It's the leader. So whether you're a low power distance or a high power distance leader, you are a leader. And so you're the one that really needs to take the initiative in understanding some of the dynamics that can happen and be careful not to misinterpret what people are doing. Okay? So it's just something, it's hard to do that sometimes. So we may have filled in some of this, I was kind of hurrying at the end of class. In multicultural meetings, many times the Europeans and Americans dominate while Asians and Latin Americans sit and listen. And that's the reason. Europeans and Americans, I'm talking about Western Europe here. And so the Western world tends to be more assertive in a meeting, in a church service or whatever. Whereas Asians and Latin Americans are fun-loving. They love to interact. They're very social people. But at the same time, when it comes to a formal meeting, they will normally allow, the Europeans and Americans to dominate. Think about it. Where has most of missionary activity in the last 200 years come from? Europe and America, right? Now that's changing a lot today. So this has been an issue, okay, for a long time. All right. And I just liked this. I can't even remember where I got this. I may have gotten it from one of the books. Diversity, handled with cultural intelligence, leads to more productive participation. Diversity, and so when we talk about cultural intelligence, we're talking about what we just discussed. Being aware of these potential differences and not being offended by them. Okay? All right. Any questions or comments about power distance before we move on to the next one? All right. everybody warm enough? If you get too warm, you can mess with those windows. All right, so let's, oh, no, before we go on to risk, I'm sorry, I do have some other slides that are not in, these are not in your notes, but some things I want to show you. Power distance indexes are subject to whoever, put them together, but by and large, they tend to be fairly accurate, okay? Remember, we said earlier that Sweden is considered one of the lowest power distance countries in the whole world. Germany, here, US, I mean, all of these really are fairly close together. There's quite a jump when you go to France, more high power distance than India, China, Russia, and Japan would again, they're only selecting a few example countries here to give us an idea. All right. So, and I think I've already talked about Robert's Rules of Order in this class, have we not? Didn't we discuss this? So, again, just as a reminder, be careful, because remember that Robert's Rules of Order was designed to function in the Western world. It was designed to manage conflict, because in the Western world where debate is welcomed, then you have to have some sort of a mechanism to manage that debate so that it doesn't get out of hand, right? Parameters have to be established. So like in a church business meeting, you don't have to tell people, now look, here's the limit, when nobody gets up and punches anybody. You don't have to say that because, well, maybe you do. Maybe you've been in a church where that's happened. My brother was a pastor in a church once many, many years ago out in California, where he eventually left because the church was problematic. And at the last deacons meeting he attended, just before he walked in, the chairman of the deacons walked over to him. They had coat and tie on, and he opened up his coat and he said, "Just in case." And there was a revolver in his pocket there. So sometimes you do have to, but generally no. But Robert's Rules of Order is Western. So if you try to implement the kind of voting and discussion system that we use here, when you go to India or Japan, you might find that it doesn't work, okay? And we talked about that a little bit before. It'll probably come up again. The case study I'm not going to get into, that's the one about Mr. Ma that some of you remember from Intro to Missions class. This would be Mr. Ma over here. He's one guy, and the colors don't mean anything, okay? This isn't Republicans and Democrats, okay? This is just Mr. Ma, being a man of stature, a man of social position in the community, is going to carry more weight than perhaps, the collectivity of everybody else in the group. So just keep that in mind. By the way, in the early church, think of the early church in Jerusalem. Was there one leader who just seemed to stand head and shoulders before everybody else? Who was it whose name keeps coming up in the book of Acts in relation to the leadership in the Jerusalem church? Yes, James, the brother of the Lord. James and the elders, several times. So that even though, there is autonomy among the churches, James still stands out as an influential leader. And at the Jerusalem Council, when Paul and Barnabas are done talking and Peter has spoken, who stands up to wrap the thing up? James. Okay? All right. So, just some examples in the Bible. Abraham was called the friend of God. Low power distance, right? In Exodus 3, the Lord used to speak to Moses face to face as a man speaks to his friend. So both Moses and Abraham experienced a low power distance relationship to God. Now, how low? Okay, when it comes to God, it's still going to be high power distance, but relatively speaking, comparatively speaking, it's a low power distance relationship. You understand what I'm saying? Compared to the way other saints related to God. Jesus, this is very interesting. In the upper room, Jesus said, "You call me teacher and Lord," and that's right. High power distance. Teacher, Lord, master, rabbi, became known as rabbi. But notice in the same encounter with his disciples, he says, "No longer do I call you servants, for the servant does not know what his master is doing, but I have called you friends." So they call him teacher and Lord, and correctly so, but he also manifests a desire to have an intimate relationship with them, something that a boss and employees in a high power distance culture don't normally do. Okay? Paul is writing to the Thessalonians, and he's a man of apostolic authority, and yet he says, we were gentle among you as a nursing mother tenderly cares for her own children. He's expressing intimacy with the believers there, and that reduces the gap between the leader and the followers. Okay, back to the upper room. After Jesus says, you call me teacher and Lord, I've called you friends, what's he do? Now, this is interesting, because when Jesus washes the disciples' feet, what position is he taking in relationship to his disciples? Yeah, he's not placing himself equal or just above. He actually is now placing himself in a position inferior to his disciples. And that's why you can understand when Peter said, you'll never wash my feet. No way. This is very uncomfortable. And I just want to remind you, there are going to be times in your ministry, especially if you go to a high power distance culture, where something like this might happen. You know, Jesus acted in a way that just was completely out of sync. It was like a bone out of joint to them. This is not right. But he did it to show them, this is the way I want you to lead, you know, when you go out after I'm gone. So it's a fascinating passage. And then, look at this. That isn't just the upper room, but even in the millennial kingdom, Jesus says, blessed are those servants whom the master finds awake when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will dress himself for service and have them recline at table, and he will come and serve them. So even in the millennial kingdom, Jesus is going to serve his people. That doesn't mean that he's going to be below them, okay? But he's going to act in a way that shows a heart that is united and bonded with his people. It's hard to really really wrap your mind around that. It's an amazing statement. But it's all about power distance. Acts 11. Remember when the church in Antioch was started, they sent Barnabas. Barnabas goes up there, and what's he do? Does he say, scoot over, I'm in charge now? High power distance? No. He goes up and he comes alongside them. I mean, he lives up to his name. Barnabas means son of exhortation, someone comes along. In fact, the word exhorted is related to the word for Barnabas. He exhorts them, he comes alongside, and he exhorts them to remain faithful to the Lord with steadfast purpose. I think I've used the word player coach. He acts like kind of a player coach. He is a leader. Everybody recognizes that, but he exercises low power distance, working alongside the disciples in Antioch. It's amazing. There's the famous passage where Jesus says, the Gentiles like to lord it over, but don't be like them. Whoever would be great among you should be your servant. And whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. Absolute contradiction to the whole Roman first century attitude toward leadership. Completely flip-flopped. Okay? Here, can you give me a reference in the Bible? I'll give you a hint. It's about Jesus that really, really expresses the extremes of power distance. Where would you go? What passage really describes the extremes of power distance as it relates to Jesus himself? If you had to summarize it all in one passage. It puts high power distance and low power distance together, all in the person of Jesus. Yeah?
You're talking about when he's praying in the garden about the will of the Father.
That's an example. That's not the one I have in mind, but that is an example. Jesus being Lord of all, and yet he's submitting himself to the cross, and he'll become that's a good one.
Philippians.
Yeah, I'm thinking of Philippians 2. Okay, again, there are several passages. Emma, your passage is absolutely right. I'm thinking he being in the form of God. See, he puts himself in the form of a servant. Okay. He humbled himself. As a result, he is highly exalted. See the contrast here? High and low power distance are both apart. Jesus has experienced both sides of this cultural value more than anybody else ever could. Nobody has ever experienced the extremes of power distance like Jesus has. And yet this is all part of God's saving plan for us. Yeah, amazing. Amazing. All right. Well, let's go on to risk, the next one, okay? So let's see. How many of you would consider yourselves fairly risky? You like taking a risk. You don't mind a dangerous situation. I know that's going to depend. Okay, I don't think anybody's, stupid. But how many of you thrive on a chancy situation? No, you do, Ella? Can you give me an example?
I don't know. I mean, I don't mind not having like plans for things, and I like I just like high energy things, I guess.
So if you go on, let's say you get a 2-week vacation from work, okay? Are you the kind that would plan everything out really, really detailed, or we just kind of go and see what happens and what's next and take one day at a time?
I just see what happens. I never make plans.
All right, good. Which one you had your hand up?
Oh, Justin, not me.
Justin?
Hey,
Did you have your hand up?
I'm like.
He's not taking a risk. You're kind of so-so. Yeah.
Depends on the situation.
When you play, go ahead, James.
Yeah, I'd say I'd be willing to play just because I'm willing to get in an uncomfortable situation, just because I feel like it helped me grow.
Okay. And that is somewhat typical of athletes. And you played soccer. 2 of you played soccer. Who else? Let's see, it was just you. You played soccer. So you guys, some athletes thrive in tense situations, and they're willing to take a risk to make it all happen, Others are more conservative, but that is often a characteristic of people who are involved in competitive sports. Yeah. Yeah, you played. Oh, yeah. By the way, how's your ankle? Or your knee, sorry.
Better.
Is better. You still wearing the?
No brace.
Good. So, yeah. Let's see. How many of you have played Farkle, the dice game? A few of you? Are you the kind that just likes to keep rolling and take a chance, or are you going to stick with the 400 points you got and pass the dice? Yeah.
I think one way to look at it is, as someone who kind of likes taking risks, I kind of view it as the greater the risk, the greater the reward. For say in sports, I try a move that's risky, probably doesn't work all the time, but it works, then it looks really good. That's kind of one way I kind of view risk.
And what I'm hearing you say too is, even though the successes might be a little bit fewer, depending on the size of the risk, when you do get a success, it's something you remember. It's worth hanging on to. Yeah. So a lot of times, risk takers are people that know that the successes, might not be as abundant because, depending on what kinds of risks you take, but when you get one, it's one that you can hang on to. That's good. Some people would say that for a Christian, there really shouldn't be any such thing as risk-taking, okay? Because if you believe that God's will is perfect for your life and you trust Him and the Spirit of God leads you, then is there really any place for risk in the Christian life? What do you think about that? Is it right for Christians who believe in the sovereignty of God in their lives to even talk about risk? Ella?
Sometimes what God wants you to do isn't clear, so you have to take a chance on something.
Okay.
Just trust that He's going to help you and lead you.
Okay, so from where you sit, it may be a risk because you don't know what's going to happen, but you also understand that it's not a risk for God. God's not up there calculating the odds of something happening. He knows, He's in charge. So a lot of times it's a risk, from where we sit. We're not sure exactly what God wants, what He has in this. All right, that's a really good point. Yep. All right, let's, now, this is something you have to get used to, okay? Notice the word high and the word low, okay? High risk is the same thing, pretty much, as low uncertainty avoidance. You just have to get used to using both of them. It gets a little confusing at times. I've done this enough, I think I got it figured out. But so high risk means that you do not avoid uncertain situations. So you're low uncertainty avoidance. So you're coming to class on slippery sidewalks this morning, okay? If you're high risk, that means you're not going to worry about falling down. You're going to be late, so you're running and you're sliding and you're not too worried about it, okay? Whereas if, maybe you've fallen down, like I have a couple of times, not this year yet, but low risk means high uncertainty avoidance. And so you're coming to class and you're being very, very careful, low risk. You have a high level of avoiding uncertainty on the sidewalk. That's the type of thing we're talking about. That makes sense, everybody? They're both low and they're high, okay? So here we are, number 3, low versus high uncertainty avoidance. Again, there's a way of trying to visualize it so you can see both the low and the high. I put the words low on this side and high on this side, and the arrows contrary, so you can kind of get a mental image of that. I don't know if that helps or not, but I like mental images. Now, there are some students of risk who would say that avoiding risk is not necessarily the same as avoiding uncertainty. For example, if you're a Christian in a country where you know that speaking up for Christ is a high risk, you may take that risk, but you are not avoiding uncertainty because you, out of conviction, are doing what you're doing. Some of you know Tony Dungy, former NFL coach and now commentator. And I didn't listen to it, but I heard that he spoke at a pro-life march last week and came under fire for it. Okay? Now, as far as I know, what I've heard about Tony Dungy, he's a very solid, dedicated Christian, and he wasn't afraid. There's a sense in which, in the eyes of many, he took a risk doing that. He could risk his career, he could risk his reputation in the media, okay? But from where he sits, he is absolutely certain about his position, his convictions, he's not afraid to do it. So, I don't know if that makes sense, but sometimes you do something that looks risky on the outside, but because of your conviction on the inside, it's not. You're not being sloppy, if I can say it that way. Anyway, that's just something to think about. So, do any of these describe you? Here we go. No. I don't know why this thing, sometimes this computer especially gives away all my secrets at once. I feel anxious when the future seems unpredictable, okay? Oh, these are all already printed out for you. I guess I'll just go ahead and throw it up there. It makes me uncomfortable when someone provides unclear directions. Managers should provide workers with detailed instructions and expectations. I prefer to manage my money using highly structured budget plans. I'm going to ask you a question here. Just you mentioned, like, when you have a trip or something, you plan, you just kind of take it as it comes. When you come to take a course like this one, do you expect a detailed syllabus with very detailed instructions about every assignment? Or are you okay with me just saying write a paper and we'll talk about the details later?
I'd be fine with you just saying
Okay.
I mean, I feel like if you're going to be that vague about it, you're not going to be super strict with grading.
Oh, okay. So you're reading into that by saying, okay, the fact that he's kind of general here probably means he's going to be kind of general when he grades it too. And that is probably, for the most part, true. If a professor is super, super detailed, and you see some of you have probably seen rubrics that have 8 or 10 elements to it, you're thinking, okay, this guy is going to be looking at this with a fine-tooth comb. But then you get another professor who gives 2 instructions. Is it the right number of pages? And did the student do a decent job of explaining it? Then you're probably thinking, okay, the professor is going to be a lot more relaxed about the way he approaches the grading of this paper. So, anyway, it's just interesting to think about. Okay. Okay. Boy, there's so much I want to say, but we'll come to those things later on. Uncertainty Avoidance Index. Number 2 on your paper there is the level of tolerance that you have for unpredictable, ambiguous situation. Now remember we talked about power distance? To what degree would a community tolerate strong leadership, right? Same thing happens with risk. How much is a society, a community, willing to tolerate unpredictable, ambiguous situations? I should have asked how many of you like it when the professor gives very detailed instructions on the syllabus. Okay, you like that. I would expect that. German precision. Yeah, you too. Armenian precision. Just kidding, I don't know. Yeah. Right. So, how much are you willing to tolerate unpredictable situations? There are some people that don't tolerate predictable situations. It's too structured. This is no fun. Everything's got to be bop, bop, bang, bang, bang. Let's just go out and have a good time, right? When you play basketball or soccer, you want to have a detailed game plan? This is what we're going to do, or you just want the coach to say, go out there and give it all you got? There's a difference, in the level of risk. There are coaches who are very low risk, and therefore their game plans are always very detailed, and they've got people throughout the course of the game giving them counsel and telling them this is the odds of doing this or that. It happens in every level. Now, there are lots of definitions of risk, and I'm going to just give you some others here that are not in the notes. You don't have to know these, but I thought you might enjoy seeing them. A situation involving exposure to danger, okay, whatever that danger might be. The potential for uncontrolled loss of something of value, okay. The possibility an outcome will not be as expected. These are all definitions of risk. How well people can cope with anxiety. Get freaked out, if things aren't. The extent to which people tolerate ambiguity or uncertainty, that's the definition I gave you. And then just kind of boiling it down to these 2 words. Risk involves exposure. In fact, we're going to probably look at this later, but when Paul is greeting people in Romans 16, he mentions Aquila and Priscilla, and all he says about them is that Aquila and Priscilla risked their necks. That's what the King James says. The word there in the Greek language is just the word delivered. They delivered themselves over. In other words, they exposed themselves to something. He doesn't tell us what it is. But Aquila and Priscilla exposed themselves in some way that represented danger or potential danger to them. And so risk always involves some level of exposure, and then vulnerability. To what extent are you willing to be in a place where you become vulnerable? See, where your safety is vulnerable. On an icy street, do you like getting out in the car and, do you like getting in the parking lot and doing donuts? Can't do donuts the front wheel drives. I learned to drive in a 3-speed on the floor. It was a 1967 Chevelle. Rear-wheel drive, 3-speed on the floor. We did lots of donuts. We were kind of stupid, too. All right. In the world, the darker the area, the higher the uncertainty avoidance, or the lower the risk is. Okay? So, yeah, Germany. It's not super, it's kind of in the middle. United States is a little bit more on the risky side. China is actually the lightest of all. These white ones here are areas where they didn't get data, so they don't have any data. But China is very high risk. Now, that is interesting, and we could talk about that, because China is a very controlled society, right? Totalitarian. You remember the mask mandate, they had total mask control, and then they decided to do just the opposite and took them all off, and now everybody's getting sick. Over tens of thousands of Chinese are getting COVID, and there's a big problem. So why would you call that high risk? It's not because, in spite of the totalitarian government, the sheer population of China, makes it impossible for the government to control everybody. And so the high risk factor is still there, even though they have a totalitarian government. Does that make sense? In spite of the politics, the people in general are still are still very much a high-risk people. They don't, that's one of those illustrations where culture changes very slowly, even if you have a totalitarian government. That government it's going to take that government decades, if not centuries, to change the fabric, the root system of the culture. It just doesn't happen quickly, okay? That's why when our country experiences presidential differences, Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal, it's not like in one presidential term, our country can completely change. Even the cultural revolution that is going on today is still, there are a lot of things changing on the surface, but that are not affecting the foundation stones of our culture, at least not as fast as we may think there is. Okay, so here we go. And in your notes, I put a couple of maps too, and you see how Germany is considered high uncertainty avoidance. Precision, Japan also, Singapore, okay, and again, these are just examples. Sweden, low power distance, low risk avoidance, high risk, low uncertainty avoidance. Think about that. When you have a culture that is low power distance, there is a certain sense in which the authority is running a greater risk. The higher the power distance, the more securely the leader can control the people and manipulate everything, right? But when the power distance shrinks, then the people become more involved in decision making, the risk factor increases. Does that make sense? Okay, right, because the locus of control is now broader, and that creates a higher potential for risk. Okay, so here we go. Let's start with the, we're actually starting with the low uncertainty avoidance there, yeah. There's less structure and minimal routines. Give me an example of, here in the States, an example of low structure and minimal routines in our culture. What would be an example of that? Relaxed, a lot of room for variation. Where would you see that? Can you think of an example? Minimal structure. Yeah.
Well, a lot of people work from home now, so this is very likely they can just do what they want.
Okay, yeah, even the work environment is less structured overall. And frankly, COVID did have something to do with that, but I think it was already embedded in our culture. It's just that COVID gave us the opportunity to put it in practice. So yeah, working out of your home, instead of going to work and punching in, and that's a low power distance thing as well. Right. Anything else come to mind? Yeah, Emma? Okay, how you use your spare time, all right, your weekends. It used to be in our country that, what you did, for instance, especially on Sunday, was very, very controlled because gas stations weren't open on Sunday. So if you were going to get gas and go somewhere on Sunday, you had to fill up on Saturday night. I remember that. When I was a kid, I remember my parents taking the car to the gas station Saturday afternoon to fill it up with gas so we could go someplace on Sunday if we wanted to. But that's much more relaxed now. What about dress code? Okay, are we worried so much in our culture about what people will think of our position because of the way we dress? Now, there are some places where that's still, any of you work at a place where there's a dress code, like at a bank or something, where you're not allowed to wear open-toed shoes? My daughter worked at one of these banks, it was Wells Fargo for a while as a teller. They weren't allowed to wear open-toed shoes. There were certain kinds of blouses and things that they weren't allowed to wear, okay, because of the image factor. But that is relaxed overall in our culture. So there are lots of things like that. Number 2, dealing with challenges as you go. There you go, Ella. All right. Well, what if we can't find a hotel, or what if we can't find a place to eat? Well, we'll worry about it when we get there. Cross that bridge when we come to it. That's a low risk statement. Number 3, little sense of feeling threatened by surprises. In fact, high-risk people like surprises. That's the spice of life, In fact, compare it to spicy food. How many of you like really spicy food, like Thai food? You like that? Yeah, I do too. Well, I have my limits, but you know, there are people, even when they go out to eat, they say, okay, I know what I like and I'm going to stick with that, you know. Well, let's try something different. No, you know, and that's okay. That's not right or wrong. It's just, but it does express this idea of high and low risk. Ambiguity and unpredictably are welcomed. This is fun. Any downhill skiers in the group? Downhill skiing? Do they do downhill skiing in Congo? No? You go to Kilimanjaro to do that, right?
That's a bad situation.
I went skiing once and it wasn't a big hill, and I didn't get my ski hooked on right. So I'm going down the hill and I come to a stop and all of a sudden my ski comes off and I just watch that go all the way down to the bottom of the hill. Now what am I going to do? I got one ski on. So one of the guys on duty comes up and brings the ski and he says, you know, he kind of reprimands me. He says, you're supposed to have that latched on. I said, I did. I thought I did, but you know, I'm not a skier. All right. Minimum of strict laws. Ooh, let's talk about the Faith Student Handbook. So how many of you, now look, I'm not going to report this to anybody. This is just in-house. It's right. It stops here, okay? And online students, remember that, okay? How many of you feel like the Faith Handbook is got too much in it, too much detail? We could get rid of some things, some of this fluff in the handbook and still be fine. Some of you may be thinking, but you're not going to raise your hand. Anybody think the Faith Handbook needs more? You know, we need more than we got. I mean, there's the potential for all kinds of things to happen that we haven't dealt with in the handbook. Anybody feel that way? Yeah. Everybody pretty happy with the handbook? Yeah, you guys are.
There are certain areas where I feel like there's a little too many lives.
Okay. Yeah.
I feel like something you just kind of have to take in.
Okay. Yep. And that's okay. And the fact is, there's no way that we can expect everybody to have the same opinion about, you know, about something like a handbook because we're all wired differently. They tell us that Bob Jones used to have a very small, limited handbook, but over the years, and part of the reason is because sometimes, here's what happens sometimes. I'm not saying it happened to Bob Jones, but sometimes you have an incident, and that incident happens on campus, and bam, because of that, you add a rule, and then something else happens over here. And so what happens is, you know, one student that's crazy does something wrong, and because of that, now it becomes a standard in the handbook. The other attitude is, hey, that's an exceptional situation. We will treat it that way and not go making a rule in the handbook just because something out of the ordinary happened. See the difference? One's a more high risk, saying, okay, it happened. But if it becomes a pattern, if it continues to happen, then yeah, we'll think about putting it in the rule book. Otherwise, just go on with life. Risk. So those who are making the decisions about what's in the handbook and what is not have to deal with high and low risk as they view it. There's a lot to this. Very interesting. How many doctrines, how specific is your church's doctrinal statement going to be? Well, if we don't specify this, we may get somebody coming in and joining the church that has a different position. And now, you know, we got a problem. Well, you know, is that something that's a big enough doctrinal issue that you feel it needs to be stated or not? See, these are all things that are important. All right, real quick, high uncertainty avoidance. There are extensive laws for everything. Where in our country can you think of an example of very high uncertainty avoidance? Very specific, extensive laws. Give me an example in our culture.
I feel like we have pretty specific traffic laws.
Yes, that's the first one that comes to my mind, traffic laws. Think of the signage out there. The specifics of signage, the lines. You know, there are some countries in the world where lines and signs are decorations. But in our country, they really do mean something. And if you get in an accident, they got cameras, they're going to examine that and how fast you were going and all that. Delaney, what were you going to say?
I was thinking about the military.
Okay, the military, right. Now, we could ask the reason why the high uncertainty avoidance. When it comes to traffic laws, like it or not, what's really driving that is economics. Insurance companies won't cover you if this or that. So a lot of times extensive traffic laws are made in order to satisfy insurance company demands and the potential for economic issues. Military, obviously the issue of security, right? And national security is high on everybody's list. Many religious customs often accompany a high uncertainty avoidance society. Everybody needs to, tendency to attach oneself with the dominant culture group. So if there are different religions in your country, or but your neighborhood tends to be more Catholic, then you might find yourself, even though the Baptists came in and their message makes sense, I can't tell you how many times people would say to me, no, you're right. This is what the Bible says the Catholic Church is wrong. What do? They stay right in the Catholic Church. Why? It's low risk. The community, their family and friends are all in the Catholic Church. And even though they see the error of the church's teaching, they prefer to stay in order not to run a risk. I'll tell you, that's frustrating. But that's where you have to say, Lord, you got to resolve this. Okay, well, I guess that was the end of that. Well, we'll stop there for a day. That helpful? I hope that these are things that are obvious, but we're trying to bring them together and analyze why we do what we do. Okay, thank you.